Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story. And I'm sure we're about to find out what really happened on that night when Walter just disappeared. So I'm sure we're going to find those answers. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 3 of our story. "I know this is hard on you, Albright," said the nurse sympathetically, "but keep strong." I was heartily relieved when finally the taxi rolled up to our front door, and I observed the tall, lanky figure of my brother climbing out of the car. He looked apprehensive as he glanced towards the house. I hadn't seen Austin in 6 months, but he was as ruggedly handsome as ever, and was stylishly dressed in some trendy chinos and a smart navy blue jacket that was covered in silver zippers. I knew what he was thinking. He was praying with all his heart that my mother was still alive, so that he could get to say his goodbyes to her. I wanted to run out of the doors to greet him, to throw my arms around him, to welcome him back home, but instead I remained rigidly stiff in my mother's bedroom, unable to move a muscle, as the nurse scurried off to the front door to welcome my brother in. "Albright! The best news ever! Your brother's taxi is here! He's arrived! This is great news! Our prayers have been answered!" I guess with my brother Austin arriving at the house, the reality that my mother would shortly expire hit me hard. It wouldn't be long until she was finally gone from our lives for good, and then all that would be left of the Harris family would be me and my brother. I could hear a suitcase being flung down in the hallway, and my brother dashing as fast as he could through the house into my mother's bedroom. And there he was, standing in the doorway. I looked up at him without saying a single word, but our eyes met. "How is she?" "She's still here," I whispered. "You got here in the nick of time, thank God." "It's not going to be long now, Austin. I'm so afraid. I'm dreading this moment when she's gone from our lives for good." "Thank God I got here in time." My brother rushed over to grab a chair, and he drew it to my mother's side of the bed and sat down on it, holding my mother's thin hand in his. Mum, it's me." In that extraordinary moment, my mother suddenly sat up from her bed upright. She appeared wide awake and alert. I was absolutely astounded. In fact, I thought I was going to pass out in shock. My mother had been out of the count for several days now. But now that Austin had arrived, she had arisen from her slumber, like a phoenix from the ashes. "You're here, Austin. I've been waiting for you to come," she cried out happily, her face breaking out into a warm smile. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I knew you wouldn't let me down." She then flopped back on her pillow and mumbled, "You have to tell Albright the truth about her father. Promise me you'll tell her the truth. It's very important. Promise me, Austin." "I promise, Mum. Don't you worry. I will tell her absolutely everything. I just want you to know, Mum, we love you so much. We really, really do." "Oh, I'm so glad you came. You need to tell Albright. I won't be able to rest in peace if you don't." "Mum, don't you worry about it. I will tell her everything." "You're a good boy, Austin. A very good boy. Just like your father you are. Oh, I'm so tired. I'm so tired." Moments later, with one final breath, my mother breathed her very last. That was when Austin took me into his arms lovingly, and we cried and cried. For how long, I don't actually know, but in truth it felt like a lifetime. After my mother's body had finally been escorted away from the house in a funeral van, my brother took my hand, gave it a tight squeeze and said, "Let's go, Albright. How about we go and get some waffles and ice cream? We need cheering up.
Besides, I've got some things I need to talk to you about. Things I need to tell you."
"You mean about my father?" I asked him. "Mum was saying you needed to tell me about Dad." Austin nodded at me. There was a sadness in his eyes. I was puzzled and rather bewildered by this. I wondered if my father, who had disappeared for so long on the Mexican border, had suddenly got in contact after all these years again. But I had not prepared myself for what Austin would ultimately tell me.
Austin's account. I knew that telling my sister Albright that our father had not really disappeared all those years ago, and that me, my mother, and Aunt Heidi had staged his vanishing in order to protect me from the criminal justice system, for there are no guarantees how things would have panned out for me if we hadn't artfully covered our tracks. Aunt Heidi had worked for the sheriff's office. She knew a thing or two about staging a disappearance, which was why my mother had sought her ardent advice. While Aunt Heidi insisted I'd never have gone to prison, that my father's death would probably be viewed as involuntary manslaughter. But she perfectly understood my mother's need to cover this all up. Mothers by nature have an intrinsic need to protect their own young from whatever harm might befall them, and the last thing that my mother wanted for my life was for my reputation to be sullied forever. If the truth got out, tongues might wag, and some people falsely believe I had intentionally harmed my own father, which was absolutely not the case. Dad did not vanish all those years ago, I said to Albright bluntly, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief to tell my sister the truth. We were sitting at the diner in town, tucking heartily into waffles with maple syrup and ice cream. I had figured out we'd need something sweet when I told my sister the story, because this was not going to be an easy story to tell, and I had no way of knowing how Albright would react to what I had to convey. But I had promised my mother, in her dying moments, that I would tell Albright everything about my father. Albright spontaneously dropped her fork on her plate, wiping away the excess of maple syrup from her mouth, and looking up at me with wide, very questioning eyes.
"What are you talking about, Austin? You don't know what you're saying. Don't you remember Dad disappeared years ago? Because being a father and working for a job at the bank that he loathed, it made him fall into a deep depression. And he needed to escape from it all. That's why he left us. Don't you remember Mum telling us all about it? The police were very, very sorry about what had happened, but they said he'd chosen to disappear, and this happens more often than people know."
I remember all that incredibly well, Albright. But what I'm trying to tell you is that Dad's disappearance was staged. Me, Mum, and Aunt Heidi staged his disappearance. I know this is hard for you to hear, sis, but this is the God-honest truth.
"I don't understand. You staged Dad's disappearance," chided Albright. "But why would you do such a bizarre thing?"
"Because, Albright, Dad never left us. He would never have done so. He adored us, and would have done practically anything for his family, and especially for you, Albright. You were the apple of his eye. He was tickled pink when you were born. I remember that very well. He was one kind, very remarkable man, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't desperately miss him."
"But what are you saying? What exactly do you mean? Where is Dad, then?" asked Albright,
her eyes staring into mine. "He's dead. I'm sorry, Albright," I said, my eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't want to have to tell you this, but I promised Mum on her dying bed that I would, and so there it is."
"Dad is dead?" asked Albright, repeating the words as if the idea that her father was dead was a foreign concept that she could not possibly comprehend. "But why? Why did he die?" she asked. "I don't understand. Was he sick or something?"
"No, he wasn't sick. He was a very healthy man."
"Well then, what was wrong with him?"
"I killed him, Albright. That is what happened."
"You what?" asked
Albright, looking so astounded that her eyes were the size of large dinner plates. You killed Dad! But why would you do that? It was a terrible accident, Albright. I need you to believe me on this one. I never meant to kill our father. If you must know, I believed he was an intruder who had broken into the house. Do you remember you were 8 years old at the time? We were living in Spokane. You got excited that night because we were eating dinner by candlelight, because the power company had disconnected us from the grid, because Mum forgot to pay the electric bill. You thought eating by candlelight was charming and magical.
Yes, I do remember that, but my memory's a bit vague.
Do you remember at the time in Spokane? There were a couple of people in our neighbourhood, a couple of families, you could say, who were held up by a lone armed robber who stole all their valuables and very much threatened their lives. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember hearing something about it, but what has that got to do with anything?
Well, that night when I returned to bed, I was awakened by a very strange noise. I thought someone was being murdered, and I don't say that lightly. I immediately thought that that lone gunman had broken into our house and had ambushed Mum, given she was probably still awake due to suffering from insomnia. In a panic, I dashed to Mum's office. I was carrying a baseball bat in my hands as a means of defence. I had heard the sound coming from the office. It was so dark because of the power failure, so I couldn't see much, but someone was shaking Mum. I thought they were threatening her and hurting her. It turns out I was wrong about this. Mum was not being hurt at all. But in the darkness things can get extremely distorted and confusing. She was saying, "Please don't! Don't! Please don't!" I thought Mum was being attacked by an intruder. It never occurred to me that it was Dad that was shaking her. He wasn't shaking her violently. He wasn't hurting her. But it didn't look good in that light. So I rushed forwards with all guns blazing and thumped the intruder across the back of the head with the baseball bat, without thinking straight about what I was doing. I just hoped to knock him out. I didn't intend to harm the intruder, but unfortunately I messed up Albright.
So it wasn't an intruder, said my sister. It was Dad! You killed Dad with a baseball bat!
My sister, Albright, threw an astonished hand over her mouth.
But I don't understand. Why was Dad shaking Mum in the first place? That's not the sort of thing he would have done.
That's the whole point, Albright. Dad never laid a finger once on Mum. That was why I was absolutely certain, without a shadow of doubt, that the intruder was shaking Mum. It turns out, while Dad was looking for the electric bill that night to pay, well, he stumbled across something far worse in that walnut desk of Mother's.
He did?
Asked Aubrey.
What did he find?
A letter written to Mum from her first love, a man called Timothy. He was asking Mum in the letter if you were his daughter. You see, Albright, I regret to say this to you, but Mum had a night of passion with someone she has always loved. Someone who refused to marry her, because his biggest passion in life was ancient artifacts and stuff like that. This man's job took him around the world. He knew that such a lifestyle would be no life for Mother. Dad didn't know any of this. When Dad read the letter, he lost it, because he thought you, the very apple of his eye, might not be his little girl. But he'd also just discovered that his wife had cheated on him, and it broke his heart, as it naturally would.
Oh, my God! Please don't tell me that Dad isn't my real father. For God's sake, don't tell me that. I don't think I could handle that if you did, because Dad is the only Dad I've ever known, and I don't want anybody else to be my father.
Of course you're Dad's daughter. There's no dispute about that. You even look exactly like him. But Mum did DNA tests a long time ago, and it affirmed you were Dad's child. But when Dad read the letter, you can only imagine what was going through his mind. I heard his cries in the house. It sounded like a trapped animal that was being murdered. The sounds did not come from Mum at all. They came from our father."
"And you thought the sounds were coming from Mum, and that she was crying out in terror?"
"Exactly."
"Then you heard her saying, 'Please don't, please don't,' and you naturally assumed the worst?"
"Pretty much."
"What a mess! And on top of it all, there had to be a power failure that night in our home, so you couldn't see a single thing. Talk about an unfortunate set of circumstances."
I proceeded to tell my sister Albright the entire story. I can't honestly remember whether we ate those waffles or not, but we were most certainly the very last people to leave the diner that afternoon. I felt much lighter being able to offload the truth to my sister about what had really happened to her father all those years ago. Growing up, she'd asked so many questions about him, and we'd always brushed her off. My sister told me she believed Mum had done the right thing in burying Dad's body in the way she'd done in the woods.
"It was an accident. The trouble is people would always wonder, wouldn't they, if the truth got out? I mean, even if you were charged only with manslaughter, which would likely be the case, people would still point a finger and say, 'I wonder if he actually did it on purpose.' And wherever you go, people who didn't know you would cast doubt on your character. Because whether you like it or not, Austin, mud sticks, and people are so quick to judge and believe the worst of you. Dad would never have wanted any of that for you. He would have approved with what Mum did. And had I been your mother, I would have done the exact same thing to protect you. Any mother with any decency would do the same."
She paused for a brief moment and said,
"Do you know whereabouts in the woods Dad is buried? Because I'd very much like to go and pay my respects to him if I may."
"I do know where Dad is buried. It's close to the house. But it's probably not a good idea for you to go to the spot."
"But why not?"
she asked me, looking perplexed.
"You're making absolutely no sense, Austin."
"I'd rather you didn't go into the woods," I said tentatively, deciding that there were some things that were probably best not divulged. I didn't exactly want to tell my sister the terrifying thing that had happened to me and my good friend Ivan when we were messing around in the woods, near where Dad was buried. My sister pulled a contorted face.
"If you don't show me where Dad is buried, I'll find the place myself. I'll go and look for him."
"Good luck with that. Mum and Heidi are the only two people who know where his resting place is. And if I don't tell you where it is, then you shall never find it, and I can promise you that."
"Why are you being like this, Austin? Don't I deserve to lay some flowers down at the place where Dad is buried? I think I have a right to do that, don't you? You and Mum and Heidi kept so many secrets from me. You owe me this."
"I'll think about it. But you know something, Albright. You don't have to visit a burial place to remember our father. I'm sure wherever you go, no matter what you say to him, he will ultimately hear you. The dead are never very far from us. I certainly believe that. In truth, I can't bear to look back on the dreadful night the lights went out in our home in Spokane, Washington, because when the lights went out on that night, so did the biggest light of them all. And that light would never come on again. That was the light of my beloved father. I marvel at how I could have been so incredibly foolish. I had bulldozed into a very tense, overwrought situation, rather like an elephant in a china shop. I had read everything wrong, mistaking the man that was shaking my mother to be that of a villainous thug that had broken into our house in the middle of the night. How could I have been so stupid? There had, of course, been a couple of armed robberies in our neighbourhood. I naively assumed that our house had been targeted next by the thug in question, who was probably taking advantage of our power failure, and who the police were looking for. We knew the man was working on his own, stealing valuables from people's homes in our neighbourhood. The tragedy was he was never found. My mother knew the Peking family that had been held to ransom by this insidious guy. The man had tied up the couple with cable ties. He had threatened to kill them. He was described as armed and dangerous, as well as mentally disturbed. My parents had even been discussing getting an alarm system installed, as such was their concern over the recent spate of robberies, that had edged on the verge of really bad violence. I thought my mother had confronted this thug in the middle of the night, and as a consequence was fighting for her life, because of the strangled cries I'd heard. My mother was the type of woman who would never go down without a big fight. I thought someone had broken into our house, and my mother would not have been afraid to stand up for herself. Growing up, my father had never laid a finger on my mother, so when I'd woken from my sweet slumber and heard that terrifying screeching sound coming from my mother's study, I knew at once, well, at least I assumed, my mother was in grievous trouble. Little did I know, of course, that the wail did not come from my mother's mouth, but from my dad, who had cried out in emotional turmoil. When my mother told him the truth that was so dreadful, it probably pierced through his heart, tearing it so cruelly into shreds. I'll never forget the sound my father made, as long as I live. It sounded like someone was being physically attacked and murdered at the same time. I thought it was my mother being killed, and that the armed thug had finally broken into our house. At that very impressionable time of my young life, I relentlessly listened to heavy metal music. I would tune in to crime documentaries on television for my entertainment, and I hung around with my friend Ivan, who was fascinated by all things esoteric. I was not in a good place at the time, going through all those teenage emotions, with hormones raging all over the place. So hearing that noise in our house meant the fear of God went coursing through every vein in my body, because I naturally dreamed the very worst was happening, because when you surround yourself with darkness, it's very difficult to see the light. My mother had been a raging insomniac for so many years. She would spend so many antisocial hours of the night up and about doing stuff around the house. She would play the piano in her study, make jello in the kitchen, or anything else. She would often work on her patchwork eiderdown on her sewing machine. She would find things to do to while away the long lonely hours of the night, while the rest of the family happily slept along. My mother could be quite a scatterbrain at the best of times. I often put this unfortunate character trait of hers down to her fragmented sleeping patterns and a lack of good quality sleep. On this evening I sat up in my bed with ears perked forward, like a highly attentive guard dog. I had some harrowing visions of this armed robber that had tied poor Mrs. Peking down, now holding my mother down in her office. I could imagine my mother putting up quite some fight and not cooperating at all with the robber. And when you behave like that, you can provoke the perpetrator to murder. I was not surprised that sleep had eluded her, as she was in quite the state that evening after the blackout we had endured, and blamed herself for failing to pay the electric bill. I will admit I was hopping mad with my mother at the time for her foolish oversight, but now I knew I needed to see what on earth was going on in the study, because whatever it was, it didn't sound good. I climbed very discreetly out of my bed, being as quiet as I possibly could. I grabbed my baseball bat in my hands. My heart pounded in my chest. I tiptoed cautiously down the hallway and peered into my mother's study. The torch was perched on the desk, but it was facing away from the two dark silhouettes, so I couldn't see them clearly. I observed one figure was my mother, who I recognized instantly, and when I saw the man standing over her and shaking her in the darkness, I couldn't see him clearly. Had I done so, I would have almost certainly recognized him as my father, for my father's features, even in the dark, would have been very distinctive, because he was a very tall man. My mother was begging this man to stop, but I went straight for him with a baseball bat, whacking him on the back of the head. I had no intention of killing this man. I was hoping he'd just black out, and then we would call the police. The man fell backwards onto the floor with a mighty walloping thump, and to my horror, I realized that not only had I knocked this man out, but I'd killed him in the process. I guess I'd been oblivious of my own strength. When I cast the torchlight over his face, This time I was the one that let out an animalistic howl. "Oh my God! No! No!" I cried out. I had only just killed my father. We may have had our differences, and I was a petulant, difficult teenager at the time, but I loved my father, almost more than life itself. So there are no words to express the horror of such a terrifying moment. I would have traded places with my father in a second, as the guilt of what I had done has been a life sentence for me that I carry with me every single day of my life, like an indelible scar that is never allowed to heal. My mother, of course, cried out in horror, as you would have expected. "What have you done, Austin, to your father? What have you done? You've only gone and killed him. How could you do this? How could you do this?" "I thought a man was hurting you, Mum," I said lamely. "Dad was shaking you. He's never done that before. I thought your life was in danger. I heard your cries." "It wasn't me you heard crying, Austin. It was your father. He was in great distress. He was shaking me as a consequence. I told him to stop, but he wasn't hurting me at all. He was just very upset with me, and I can't blame him for that." I was to learn later from my mother that my father was the one that had let out a strangled cry, because he discovered a letter written to her from a man called Timothy, who was asking if Albright was his daughter. My mother had been with Timothy for one night years before, and Timothy, when hearing that my mother had an 8-year-old daughter, did the math and wondered if he was Albright's father. Of course, when my father read Timothy's letter, written in exquisite black curly italic-like writing that expressed his undying love for my mother, that was when my father realized that his beloved daughter Albright might not be his own daughter, and that my mother had cheated on him at least once. I guess he just lost it. That's why he was shaking my mother. To express, I imagine, his indignation. He was absolutely devastated to discover my mother had not been faithful during their marriage, although, according to my mother, she insisted she had only cheated on my father once, and I believe her on this. But that did not make what she did remotely right. I imagine no man wants to learn that the child they love more than life itself might not actually be their own. My mother explained to me that she had been to school with Timothy. They had fallen in love with each other. Timothy had gone to Staffordshire University and had succeeded in all his endeavours. He was incredibly bright. He went on to travel the world, explore ancient historic sites, be involved in archaeological digs, and clean up old manuscripts with his skilled hand. He also worked with the Cairo Museum in Egypt. Timothy had told my mother in no uncertain terms that although he loved her very much, that he was not the settling down type, and that he would never marry her. "I'm passionate about history and ancient artifacts," he told her. "I'm not the kind of person that would be relationship worthy, because if I were with you, I would leave you on your own for long stretches of time, and that would not be fair on you, Sammy. I would always put my research before you, and we could never have children like regular couples do, because we would be travelling all over the world. These things would consume my focus, and it would not be fair on you. Furthermore, I love you too much, Sammy, to allow you to ruin your life on my account, or to give up everything for me. It would be selfish of me to expect too much from you like this. You might end up despising me because of it. No woman ever wants to feel ignored, unloved, and neglected. And if you marry me, that's how you would feel. I want you to fall in love with someone who deserves you. That will make you happy. Knowing that someone is taking good care of you will make me very happy indeed." Even though my mother had cut all ties with Timothy, years later they met up in Spokane for a secret rendezvous, as my mother was desperate to see him once again and catch up with old news. One thing, of course, led to another, and they had spent a night of passion together in a hotel room for old time's sake, rekindling old memories. "I love your father, Austin. Well, I loved him. But don't get me wrong, she told me, with tears of great regret in her eyes. But I could never get over Timothy. I just couldn't. I would have gone with him to the ends of the earth, you know, and back if I had to. Timothy refused to commit to me. It was so devastating for me, because I would have done anything for him. He was the love of my life. But his love was ancient antiquities. It was his greatest interest, and I know in truth I would have always come second for him. I knew that, of course, but I never stopped loving him nevertheless. But he was right about everything. If I had married him, it would have been a nightmare. We'd have probably ended up getting divorced anyway, because with him never settling down in one place for very long, it would have been a disaster. I need to be rooted in one spot to be happy. All that travel would have been very unsettling. So tell me this, Mum. Did you really love Dad? Or was he just second best to you because you couldn't have Timothy? But of course I loved your father, more than anything. And I have to say, after I met up with Timothy in that hotel room, it only confirmed to me just how much I really did love your father. I guess I always held a candle for Timothy, you see. I put him up on a pedestal. I don't think I've ever met anyone like him before. His passion for ancient mysteries and the old world was so intriguing. He was a fascinating man. I guess I was always drawn to the things I couldn't have. I never meant for things with Timothy to get so heated that night, not at all. Nor did he, for that matter. We simply arranged to meet at his hotel for an evening meal. It was perfectly innocent. But it was just so good to catch up with him, to learn all about what he was doing. I wanted to remain faithful to your father, but when we saw each other, we couldn't help ourselves. We were so drawn together, like old times, I expect. I'm not proud of what I did. So then Mummy's Albright, Timothy's daughter, I asked. Is she my half-sister? No, of course she's not. She's your father's girl. I had a DNA test done a long time ago because Timothy needed to know the truth. I was relieved to see Albright was your father's. And if the truth be told, so was Timothy, if you must know. I absolutely believe such knowledge would have dismantled his life if he was to discover that he was a father. He'd have felt a duty of obligation towards his daughter, and a need to be involved in her life, because he was that kind of a man. I try not to remember how I did feel on the night when I discovered that I'd accidentally killed my father. I thought he'd been an intruder. I had wailed, "I'm so sorry, Mum. What have I done? Am I going to go to jail for the rest of my life?" "Absolutely not," my mother had said firmly. "Your father would never want that for you, and nor would I. We're going to have to make it look like your father disappeared. I'll phone my sister Heidi to ask her what we should do about this. Your Aunt Heidi is as sharp as a hawk. She'll know exactly what we need to do. Don't forget she worked for the sheriff's office for quite a while. She'll help us cover our tracks methodically. I know she will. As far as I'm concerned, I don't want the police crawling over this like maggots, over a dead man's corpse. Even if you were to go down for involuntary manslaughter as a minor, I don't trust the police as far as you can throw them. These days, innocent people are locked up for very insignificant things. And then you get the nefarious kids of wealthy parents that get away with their insidious deeds every single time. Because they're elites, and they can get away with practically anything. You hear about it all over the news. And even our own leaders have their hands covered in filth. But they get away with what they do. You did nothing wrong, son. You made a perfectly innocent mistake. And you should not be punished for that under any circumstances as far as I'm concerned. Yes, I'm devastated your father is dead, and so are you. But we can't cry over spilt milk. What's done is done. We need to be practical about this. And your Aunt Heidi knows practicality as if it's her second name. But, Mum, don't you get it? I killed Dad. Sweetheart, I keep repeating this over and over again. It was a dreadful accident. The trouble is, love, the world is not a fair place. We all know that. So you do what you need to do to survive, to protect your family. You will not stay a day in a juvenile detention centre over my dead body if I have anything to do with it. We both know this was an accident, but things can get insanely twisted, love. And before you know it, you'll be falsely accused of murder with intent. You don't know the way things will pan out for you, and I'm not prepared to take any risks as far as you're concerned. I don't want your life needlessly ruined by this oversight. Nor would your father. He'd be the first to want me to take care of this unfortunate situation. If it hadn't been for that damn power outage, you'd have likely seen it was your father shaking me. We've all been very nervous lately, and understandably so, knowing full well that thug is out there, breaking into people's houses, holding them hostage. Oh, goodness gracious me, is it any wonder you panicked and assumed the very worst? But try telling that to a court of law. They'd always twist things, because that's what they do so well. But I killed Dad, I wailed again. Mum, it makes me a murderer. You are not a murderer, Austin. You hear me, said my mother, now cradling me in her arms very lovingly, and rocking me gently, as she had done when I was a baby boy. You may be many things, Austin, and I don't deny you can be an obnoxious teenager at the best of times. Let's not kid, but your heart has always been in the right place, and underneath it all you're a very good boy. You thought I was being attacked. You came to my rescue, and I'm proud of you for that. It showed bravery and courage. You weren't aware of your own strength when you lashed out at your father. But we'll get over this, son, like we get over everything in our lives. Every hurdle in the road, we always overcome it. I know this is going to be a very hard time for us, love, but we've got to be courageous about this. Your father is out of the picture now. I'm sure he's very happy where he is. But we're the ones that have to get on with our lives. And while we'll miss your father with all of our hearts, we cannot allow our grief to rob us of our daily joy. Do you understand? It's very important. Dad would be the first person to insist upon this. I had nodded. I knew my mother was absolutely right. It was a very tumultuous time for the all of us. Aunt Heidi had arrived at our house at the crack of dawn, hours after my father had died, in her rather rusted-out old van that had almost certainly seen better days, and would have probably looked better on a scrap heap. Me and my Aunt Heidi surreptitiously loaded my father's dead corpse into the back of the van, and we ferried him to the town of Tanasket, where Aunt Heidi lived. Aunt Heidi had never been married. She described herself as a self-confessed spinster, who had no intention of tying the knot with anyone. She seemed to thrive on her independence. It was in the dead of night, on the following day, after my dad had accidentally been killed, that me, my mother, and Aunt Heidi surreptitiously buried my father in the woods at the back of Aunt Heidi's extensive property, where we had quite the funeral ceremony for him, laying down flowers on his grave, under the pearly light of the silvery moon. It was very magical and very emotional. Albright was there, of course, happily sticking flowers around the grave. She was only 8 years old at the time, naively unaware that beneath that mound of soil lay the remains of her father. She had no idea what was going on. It was strange to know that my father was under that mound of soil, but it felt as if he was with us. I could see him in my mind's eye, smiling at us warmly, giving us a thumbs up. We all cried so many tears that I was surprised I had anything left to cry in me. It had been a privilege to have a father like Walter, and I never was able to forgive myself for what I had done. It was ironic, because only weeks before my father's fortuitous passing, when me and my mother had visited Aunt Heidi, and had stayed in her house for the weekend with my father, we had all taken a casual walk in the woods at the back of the property, and my father had said to my mother, "This is the place I'd like to be buried one day, love. If you get me cremated, you can scatter me around here. I would like that very much. Little did my father know that he really would end up in these woods, his bones becoming one with the forest floor. He would have liked that, but it was far sooner than he would have ever imagined. But it certainly brought me solace that this was the place he had chosen to be, if given the choice. Shortly after my father died, my mother was very distraught, so she moved us away from our home in Spokane. We moved in with Aunt Heidi in the town of Tannisket, in the house we'd often visited for the weekends. I think my mother felt closer to my father, knowing he was buried close by in those woods, not far away from Aunt Heidi's very unremarkable-looking home. My mother was also glad to get away from Spokane, I believe, to be living in a very unpopulated and rural town, where she could grieve the loss of my dad in a very peaceful environment, where eyes were not permanently scrutinizing her every move. Everyone in our neighborhood in Spokane heard about my father's unfortunate disappearance. People looked on my mother pitifully, like the poor wronged wife who'd been miserably dumped and abandoned by her beloved husband and left so badly in the lurch. They all thought it was out of character for my father to behave like this, and they were right about that. I am certain the gossip was rife, but the last thing my mother wanted was pity from the local people in our neighborhood, so moving away seemed like the most obvious thing for our family to do. I do know it was a relief living in such a delightful town, with so many exciting hiking trails and sporting activities on offer, that I could thoroughly enjoy, that would help me not get so caught up in those dark moments of desperate grief that had consumed my young heart.
So there we are. That is the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and it's very exciting, so I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.